Hello, I'd like to welcome anybody listening to the lecture today. Today's lecture is about the Pearson-Marr archetypal indicator, or as we'll call it from here on out, the PMAI. This is sort of a roundtable review, as it says right here, about the 12 PMAI archetypes and how to interpret your test scores, and then also to look at the strengths and the weaknesses, or the benefits and the pitfalls of each one of the 12 PMAI archetypes. As you see here, I have a picture that I have created of objects I found around the house. Obviously, most of these are children's toys. A few things are not exactly toys, but for the most part, you get the idea. Well, I tried to pick out an object that I felt would represent each one of the 12 PMAI archetypes. So we'll be looking at those again at the end of the lecture. So the PMAI, in a way, is the story of you. As sappy as that sort of sounds, that's kind of how we like to look at this test that you'll be taking, or that you have taken. Because in a way, archetypes, they tell our story, but they tell our story in sort of an unconscious way. It's not right there in front of us. It's something that we have to think about and reflect on. I find this PMAI test to be useful in a number of ways, but the way I like it the most is as a tool for self-reflection. I really have learned a lot about myself through this test. Granted, I've taken it a number of times over the years. I'm kind of in the middle of it constantly in being involved in this class and everything. But I do really get a lot out of this test. I have learned a lot about who I am, what my strengths are, where my weaknesses are, those sorts of things from this test. So the first thing that we want to look at with this are is how this test might compare to some other tests that we have. And I like to go from the bottom up on these bullet points. So if you're following along watching the video, the survey that we have that you take, it's a bit different than some of the other tests. There's other tests like the MBTI and True Colors. These are tests that you may or may not have taken during your time here at Full Sail, that you may have taken in other classes elsewhere, maybe even in high school or something like that. A lot of those tests, what they do is they kind of predict how you're going to act. They kind of say, well, you really are predisposed to act this certain type of way. And that's fine. Those tests are perfectly valid. This doesn't make this test better or worse than those other type of tests. But this test, this survey, it doesn't look to predict our actions. It doesn't look to say, hey, you're an introvert, or hey, you're an extrovert. Well, this is how you're going to act in this sort of situation. Oh, you're a thinker. Oh, you think things through a lot. Maybe you have trouble feeling your feelings. Oh, you're a real feeler. Oh, maybe you just go with your gut and you don't think things through very carefully. That's sort of the MBTI. It's kind of like, maybe not quite you're an either or, but it's somewhere like that. Um, with this test, we don't really get that sort of result. In fact, our score is likely to change over time. Things are going to change. Certain scores are going to fluctuate over time. Now, your highest scores and your lowest scores, they might not change all that frequently. That might not be something that shifts. Those are the scores that kind of make up who you are. They make up your personality in a lot of ways. But the scores that fall in between, those could fluctuate from the time you take the test to, hey, you come home after a day at school or something like that, or you had a day at work. If you took the test right before getting ready for work versus right after you're done with work, you might have two completely different scores, especially with the ones in the middle. That's because what happens is we can access all 12 of these archetypes. They're all there for us to use. They're right out there. We can activate them when we need to, or we can access them when we need to. But typically, we don't have them all active at the same time. That'd almost be like having 12 different voices in your head telling you different ways to do something. It could get very, very confusing. So, as I said, we activate these archetypes. They become active in us kind of on their own. They rise and fall on their own. And that's where this sub bullet point here that says we show but do not tell, that's kind of how these archetypes work. Once again, to compare it to the MBTI, and that you might say, oh, I'm an introvert. That might be something you tell somebody. But generally speaking, you're not saying, oh, I feel like an orphan today, or boy, I really feel like a lover today. You might get stares. People might think you're kind of odd. Um, we kind of can see these archetypes present in us through our actions, our behaviors, and our thought processes. Now, I should add before I go any further that the focus of this lecture today is really looking at how these archetypes play in our own lives, how they affect our own lives, how we can use this device as a tool for self reflection. However, I do want to make sure that I add, this is also an amazing tool for character creation. You got a hero, you got a mentor type character, you got a villain or a shadow character. Well, they're going to need certain traits. You can't just say, "Hey, he's the hero." Well, what type of hero is he? Is he a fighter? Is he a warrior? Is he brave and strong, or is he funny and comical? Maybe he's brave and strong and funny and comical, but maybe he's also really adventurous. So, what I'm getting at are aspects of a personality, and we can really use this PMAI to also create fully developed, fully realized characters with genuine personality as opposed to sort of a cliched character. If you were to take just one of these archetypes and make a character just that, it would be pretty predictable how they'd behave and it'd be pretty cliche in a lot of different ways. So keep that in mind. So after you get your test back, you're going to see a a PDF file that has your scores. It's going to mark your highest scores, it's going to mark your lowest scores. And what you're going to do, what you want to look at, are for a few things. Tie scores at the top. Sometimes when you have a tie score at the top, you might have a tie in a PMAI pair. That's the last bullet point there, but that's something that indicates a certain level of balance between two different sides of one coin, sort of. And we'll get to those later in the lecture. You're also going to look for low scores. Typically, we don't have many students who get lots and lots of low scores. In fact, I don't know if I've ever seen that, but that's something to think about too. Your low scores are going to be interesting. See what your low scores are, and then also if you have a situation where you have a whole bunch of high scores, too many high scores that would make it stand out as a bit unusual. Like, for example, if you have 6 archetypes over, let's say, 25, that might be getting close to too many high scores. And so, what I mean by too many high scores is simply you just have a lot of high scores, and there might be a reason for you having that many high scores. This is, once again, this self-analysis that you have to undergo to see if that makes sense to you. The way I look at it with these high scores, and you'll see this kind of repeated on slide after slide here, is you want to start to think about your life situations, and why you might end up with 6 or 7 or 8 that are above 25. And one thing that I think makes a lot of sense for a lot of students is students especially, and especially online students, they have to do a lot of different things throughout the day, throughout their life. They have to play many different roles. So you're a student, number one. Well, the one that makes me think of is the sage, seeking new knowledge. But you're a student at a creative school. Oh, number 2, the creator. Huh. But you're also probably, if you're going back to school, there's probably some sort of dissatisfaction in your life. I don't want to generalize or make assumptions, but there's like you're looking to improve your situation in your life. So there's a warrior there, this proving your worth, and there's also a bit of a seeker looking for the next opportunity, the next big thing. So right there we have four right off the bat, and those all pertain to just being a student. Well, what about your home life? There might be a reason why you chose to go online, because, hey, maybe you have a job, a career. Maybe you have a family that you're trying to take care of. So if it's a family, well, that caregiver score might be high. That lover score might also be high, depending on how uh, important the relationships are there. Additionally, as a if you're working as well, well, your ruler score might be high. Maybe you're highly organized, and then yeah, then you just get into other things that are part of your general personality. So I've already covered more than 6 of the character archetypes. So if you have a lot of high scores, ask yourself, how many different roles do I have to play in my daily life? That's the first thing you want to ask. The other reason you might have too many high scores is because of the way you answer the questions. Some people are just sort of all or nothing people. They mark everything a 1 or a 5. And if you do that, that's going to throw off the test a bit. I'm kind of the opposite. I'm kind of like, I don't want to commit to anything too much. A 1 and a 5, those are kind of more rare for me to mark. So I tend to have test results that are a little more in the middle than at the extremes of one or the other, although my high scores are generally stand out above among the rest of them. Um, Another possible reason is the way you answered the questions is you were thinking about life in the future as opposed to right now, or life as an ideal life as opposed to life right now. So that could be a reason too. You've kind of answered the questions in an idealized sort of way. Like, for example, one of the lover questions is usually something like, I get a lot out of deep personal relationships. And you might say, yeah, I do. But you need to examine that. You need to ask yourself, oh, do I get a lot out of deep personal relationships right now? How are my relationships right now? Do I have a lot of strong relationships that I'm getting a lot out of? Or did you answer it more as a general, like, yeah, I sure get a lot out of personal relationships? The way you answer it is going to affect the test as well. So with your high scores, you will see, of course, the test will highlight your 1 to 4 high scoring archetypes, looking at ties, usually counting those as sort of 1. You want to note when and where those archetypes are active. Generally, if they're high scores, they're probably going to be active most of the time in you. That's going to be a dominant personality trait. Um, but once again, where and when these things are active, how's your life situation influence the appearance of these archetypes? Is school, home, friends, family, work, uh, relationships, personal time, all these different things. How does this going to influence you? But really, I think the most important part about looking at our high scores is this bullet point in the middle, this number 3. You need to ask yourself, how does this score make me feel? How do I feel with this? Do I feel powerful? Or do I feel limited? Does it make me feel good about myself? Or is it something that leaves me feeling frustrated? So that's a good one to think about. There's lots of times people, when they take a test, you kind of assume that if you get a perfect score on it, so let's say you got a 30 in one of your archetypes, got a perfect score, we're going to have the thought process that, hey, I'm really good at this. And you might be really good at it. I'm not saying you're not, but you need to ask yourself, do I feel good about this? Or when I'm in this archetype, when I'm living this life, do I feel limited by it? A great example of this, and we'll be getting into the strengths and the pitfalls of each archetype, but a perfect example of this would be the creator. And I think because a lot of students would automatically have high creators because you're going to a place like Full Sail. This is a good one to point out. The creator is what really fuels you, but do you fall into the pitfalls? Do you procrastinate? Do you come up with projects that kind of just repeat the same thing over and over and over again? Do you uh, do you leave everything else off to the side and just obsess on the artistic project you're working on at that moment, and everything else kind of crumbles around you? Do you want it to be perfect? Can you not stop unless it is perfect? Well, that can lead to a lot of frustration. But you could have a 30 in that, but I don't know how powerful you feel about it. Those limitations start to pop up. So once again, wonderful tool for self-reflection. You can examine, do these things make me feel strong, or do they make me feel weak and limited? It's something to think about. Middle scores, if I'm being honest, the middle scores aren't all that interesting. They're workhorses. You use them probably every day. Um, they sort of support you in this extra role. Kind of make your life easier. You can kind of activate them on and off given specific circumstances. A lot of times these are things that are about to ascend or have recently descended. Not always, though. Other times they're just there and you need them. I know if I use like personal examples, like my caregiver is somewhere in the middle, my ruler is somewhere in the middle. These things don't make up me as a human being. Like, I don't feel they define my personality really, but I have to use them. I have two little kids. Caregiver comes up. I have two little kids, and the ruler has to come up as well. But these aren't things that I like. When someone said, "Who are you, John Peter Trask? Who are you?" I don't know. I would probably gravitate toward ideas that spawn out of my strongest archetypes and probably my lowest archetypes as well. So the test will identify these in their highest and lowest, from highest to lowest order. And once again, you're going to want to examine where these archetypes rise, where they fall, when they're dominant, when they're passive, because that's probably where they are. Once again, these things probably don't define you as a person. But your low scores, those are at least as interesting as your high scores, if not more interesting. When you see your low scores, usually they're low for one of three reasons, or maybe two or three reasons, but there's a particular reason why it's going to be low. And here we have them here. It's either it's something that's dormant, it's a shadow, or it's an allergy. But that shadow and that allergy, those might blend together. That's where that self-assessment comes in. So if something is dormant, it's simply something that you've resolved in the past, or you're just not using it. It's not active in you right now. With our students, we tend to see the innocent as being typically dormant. Not always, of course. If you have a high innocence score, that doesn't really mean anything. Like negative, at least, doesn't mean anything negative. But it's often one that might be dormant in students. We get a lot of students with low innocence scores. I look at it this way: like, when you were a kid, you were an innocent, and then you had to go to middle school and high school, and well, that innocence kind of went away, and you kind of saw the world as maybe not this happy, shiny place, and well, okay, so that's not how you look at the world anymore. Innocent has kind of gone dormant. You may not hate it, you may not have an allergy to it, or it might not be something that's unaware or unrecognized in you, but it's low. It's just not being used. The destroyer is also one that I think for a lot of people it goes dormant when they're not using it. They just doesn't occupy their brain very much, and then suddenly something happens and the destroyer rises up, and hey, now it's active. those are two good examples of something that might be dormant. However, the shadow and the allergy, they tell us a lot about ourselves. The shadow comes from the Jungian term for the personality, this part of our personality that we don't recognize in ourselves. It's something that's undeveloped and we don't see it in ourselves. So we're unaware of it. A great example of this is if you've ever been hanging out with a friend or maybe talking with a parent or something along those lines, and this person you're talking with says something like, man, I really hate it when so and so does this, this, and this. Or so and so did this today, and how annoying is that? And you are stifling a laugh because what your friend just described is their own behavior and how annoying their own behavior is to them. But they've just projected that onto somebody else. They're blaming somebody else or they're pointing out that flaw in somebody else. That's the very definition of this example of a shadow. This is something that we don't see in ourselves. We need greater awareness of it. And when we see it in somebody else, it might bug the hell out of us. Or if we don't want to feel the blame, we kind of project our own faults onto somebody else. Or maybe even we see our faults as virtues. And then you got a real deep shadow that you're falling into. So, as I said before, this is such a wonderful tool for unlocking those ideas, thinking about them, contemplating, why do I have such a low whatever score? Why is it so low? Is it just an allergy to it? Do I just have a resistance to it? That could be that, just a dislike for it. Um, I think one of my scores is just a dislike, but I guess if I dig deeper and deeper, well, that dislike might be a fear of something, or it might be a struggle against something. So I know I've used this test to examine my own personality, and the shadows tell me a lot, or the low scores tell me a lot about my own weaknesses and my own behavior. And so these things that I may not like it when I see other people do, but oh boy, when I really start to examine myself, oh man, I kind of do them too. So this next section is on PMAI pairings, but really I'm going to kind of just lump it in with the section that breaks down the strengths and the weaknesses of each one of the archetypes. So here we see the 6 pairings. It has all 12 archetypes here. And each one of these pairings, as I kind of alluded to before, I kind of think of them as two sides of the same coin. They balance each other out very, very nicely. Although there's a couple down here at the bottom, I think that you could kind of pair differently if you wanted to. I think you could pair the ruler with the jester and the magician with the sage if you wanted to. And I think that would lead to a pretty good balance. Something to think about. But as I said, we'll be visiting them on these slides. So as you see here, we have them paired up. They're, innocent orphan are both in this pink, and warrior and caregiver in this, I don't know, this looks like a yellow to me. I would also like to point out that on FSO, we have a section titled Understanding the PMAI, and that section goes into much greater detail about these things than I'm going to go into here, these positive attributes and pitfalls. But just for the sake of the lecture, I'll obviously cover them here. So the innocent, the way I look at the innocent is this is a person who's optimistic. They look at the world as a generally a good place. They put their trust and faith in others. They have hope, and they have simple virtues that right and wrong. They kind of paint things as sort of a black and white fashion, and that can be a strength in a certain way because they know what's right and they know what's wrong, and that's kind of how they live their life. The innocent, however, this optimism, this blind trust can get them taken advantage of pretty easy. They fall into naivete. Um, they can also fall into a position of childishness where they're very, very dependent on the people around them because that's what they need in order to operate. They need that support. Other times they can be oblivious to the dangers of the world around them because they're so hopeful and optimistic and hey, it's all rainbow and sunshines. That's how they operate, and that's sort of that level of naivete. The orphan, on the other hand, is realistic. They're not necessarily pessimistic, at least not the balanced orphan. They're realistic. They have a resilience about them. They've been through the ringer a couple of times. They've been burned a few times. So they know the world isn't always a safe place, but they've developed an ability to bounce back from it. They're also very quick to find mutually beneficial relationships, sort of like to depend on somebody else, but also have that person depend on them. It's like coexisting very well. And they can be very empathetic toward people. The orphan, if they've been burned too many times or they fall into a certain level of despair, can become very cynical. Might complain a lot, and that cycle of abuse they that was started with their own abuse might continue through them. So they go from being a victim to being a victimizer. So the innocent orphan, you can almost like if you just crisscross these two things, they almost cancel each other out. Realism and resilience and interdependence, it cancels out this naivete, this denial, this obliviousness, this childishness. They they don't fall into this despair that the innocent might fall into if things get too hard. Likewise, the innocent's optimism and trust in others cancel out that sort of cynicism and that complaining about everything all the time. So if you have two characters or there's two people and they both fall into these two various archetypes, if they both would score really high on both of them and they were both balanced, they would sort of help each other out a whole lot. Likewise, if you had both of these traits very high in you, that would be a very nice balance to have. The warrior is about proving one's worth. And to do this, generally, a warrior is highly disciplined and determined. They usually have a skill that's involved with that. They're willing to fight for what they want, whether it's literal or figurative. And they're courageous. They're willing to put themselves out there and they're willing to fail if need be to just try and do their best. There's an inherent competitive nature to this archetype. And that also shows through in the imbalanced archetype. For when a person gets too competitive, they kind of turn everything into a contest that they need to win. And that's the imbalanced warrior. And they can also become really arrogant, especially if they're successful in their uh, achieving their goals. They might develop a certain level of arrogance. And if they're not so successful, well, they might start picking on people who it's easier to win against. They might become a bully. The caregivers, the name says it all. They're compassionate, they're nurturing, uh, generous with their time and their money and the effort they put into things. And they have this great sense of community in the sense of like a rising tide, it lifts all boats. But sometimes the caregiver can care too much. They can care to the point that they stop caring for themselves. That's martyrdom, where you put your needs so far at the back of the line that it's hurting you now to care for others. Likewise, the caregiver can use that martyrdom to guilt trip people. Oh, the things I do for you, and that's the thanks you give me. I'm sure we all heard that at some point from somebody. So they're pointing out how much they do. Oh, I'm such a martyr. And now I'm going to guilt you and control you and manipulate you through guilt to try and get you to behave the way I want you to behave. Other times, caregivers care too much. They become codependent or they start enabling others in really negative ways. Once again, you can sort of see these things cancel each other out. It's pretty hard to be an arrogant bully who has to win all the time if at the same time you're also really community minded and nurturing and generous. That just these two kind of cancel each other out in a way. They cancel out the negatives. Um, Likewise, a person who's really determined and goal oriented and courageous and has lots of discipline, they're not going to resort to guilt tripping. They're not going to martyr themselves and think about everybody else before themselves because they have that inherent competitive streak in them. So here we have the seeker and the lover. Now, the seeker is a way I kind of define the seeker understands themselves by the experiences they've had. They define themselves by the experiences they've had. So to do this, they're very autonomous, really sure of themselves, and they have a sense of ambition. Sorry, my voice is kind of bad right now. Apologize for that. They kind of look at the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, but that can lead to a level of disappointment in them, especially if they fall into the imbalance side of the seeker. They're always looking for the next big thing, the next adventure, the next goal that they want to accomplish. And this can lead to this disappointment. And it can also leave them very alienated because sometimes a seeker gets so wrapped up in what they're going to do and the thing that they're going to do and the goals that they have that they find themselves alienated. They find themselves all alone because they've kind of gone from place to place to place and they've never put down roots and they've never established strong relationships. The lover sounds romantic in nature, but it's really not. So if the seeker is defining themselves by the experiences that they've had, the lover is defining themselves by the relationships they keep. So this is a person who is very passionate. They're quick to commit to others. They connect to others really, really easily. They connect very well. And there's an enthusiasm that they have about the relationships and the activities they do. They're just kind of excited about it, and they're really happy to meet new people. I think of if you know someone who can remember everybody's name and not just their name, but like their spouse's name, you're dealing with someone who's got a very high lover score. The lover falls into trouble when they start objectifying others. And you might think of that in a sexual way. We have sexual pleasure here for the lover, and that can be a part of this archetype. Obviously, romantic relationships are a part of it, but you can objectify anybody. It's sort of just using them, using people for your own personal gain. What benefits you at the moment? You're moving. Oh, I know I have this old friend who has a truck, but I haven't talked to him in 3 years. Well, let me buddy up to him so that he'll let me use his truck. That's an objectification. Any sex and love addiction, promiscuity, obsessive behavior, like relationship obsessive, like stalker behavior, things like that, jealousy, those sorts of things all fall into that imbalanced lover. Another thing that falls into the imbalanced lover is sort of losing oneself in a relationship, another aspect of that codependence. Well, you could see where the strengths of the seeker, autonomy, ambition, those things would cancel out that codependence in the imbalanced lover. They would also cancel out that sort of jealousy and that sort of stuff as well, because kind of what it's doing is sort of like, well, hey, the grass is greener someplace else. This relationship didn't work out. Let me move on to the next thing. That's kind of what the seeker does. The seeker's tendency to become alienated and lonely, well, that doesn't fit with the lover at all. So you can see where these two things would make a very nice pairing. The destroyer is sounds really negative. It sounds like probably everything you imagine the pitfalls to be like, but really the destroyer is about letting go and moving on from bad things. Something bad happened to you. You lost your job. You just broke up with your significant other. Someone close to you passed away. Well, you're going to grieve that loss. That's going to sit with you for a while, but at some point you have to move on from it. You got to move on and uh, and that's when the destroyer is going to become active. It's about letting go. It's about that change, that metamorphosis. In a broader sense, it could be revolutionary. The system isn't working. We have to tear it down and rebuild it. That destroyer might be a good thing. But, one person's revolution might be another person's act of terrorism. So it depends on how brutal and violent this action is. The imbalanced destroyer can get out of control in their rage. They can get sort of obsessive need for vengeance because they can't move on from this thing until they feel like they've paid back what's been done to them. So they might be willing to harm others or harm themselves. The creator this is another one where the name kind of just says it all. This is a person who's really creative. I like to say they have the vision in their head and the skill to make that vision a reality. Very imaginative, coming up with new ideas for projects, but also new ways to try and accomplish old goals, things like that. The creator can fall into a level of self-indulgence where it's like this is all they do. This is what they want to do, and they don't care about anything else, and everything else kind of gets shoved to the side. And that in and of itself is an element of procrastination. I know I've used my own creative projects to procrastinate work that I really should be doing instead of whatever it is I am doing at the time. And then there's that desire for perfectionism where it's got to be perfect. I got to make it perfect. How I can't stop unless it's perfect, and then it never gets done. It never finishes up because it never quite lived up to the the vision I had in my own head about it. So you can see once again these two pair off really really nicely. Destroyer creator, they just sound like they cancel each other out just by their very names. The creator's vision and imagination is going to come up with more productive ways to handle the negative feelings that the imbalanced destroyer might be feeling, and it might also when the destroyer is sort of on a tear, wrecking everything, well, the creator can step in and say, "Hey, this could be useful. That could be useful. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater." Likewise, the destroyer's ability to let go kind of cancels out that procrastination or that desire for perfection. So here we have the ruler. The ruler is about taking control. It's about understanding how the system works, being really responsible, uh, delegating tasks to people, taking a position of leadership in some sort of way, and doing your best to make sure everything runs smoothly. And once again, things run smoothly because, well, you're responsible and you're under control and you understand the rules that you're trying to deal with, this system savvy. Rulers, of course, I'm sure we've all dealt with some kind of a boss at maybe a retail job or a restaurant job that just was this rigid, controlling, entitled jerk who demanded compliance or you're going to do things my way or the highway. That sort of really dominant mentality, this tyrannical mentality. The magician is about change and transformation. It's about inspiration and looking for others to be inspired by. That it's sort of like the change that comes from within and then works its way out. I think some good examples of this would be like, like inspirational religious figures, um, self-help books, 12-step groups, um, things like that are to transform how you feel about yourself. And it's going to kind of come once again from the inside out. So it's this healing change that comes through the magician. The magician also kind of looks to inspire that change in others around them, to look at somebody else's potential and really nurture that and try and push them toward their ultimate potential. So the magician does that as well. So they're very inspiring and they look to inspire others and they look to be inspired. I think that's a good way to sum that up. And the pitfalls that the magician starts to fall into are they can use that charisma, that natural charisma they have, to manipulate people. So any cult behavior, any sort of like this, I'm a guru of such, and now I'm going to tell you how you should live your life. That's probably fallen into the pitfalls of the magician. A lot of times, magicians sort of disconnect from reality. They get so wrapped up in this sort of, um, um, I don't know, metaphysical, esoteric, kind of just out there stuff that they sort of disconnect from the reality around them. Um, so that's where you start to get that imbalance with the magician. Now these two, they balance each other really well, but not so much in a crisscrossy kind of way. Like I don't see rigid controlling mentality being canceled off by this renovative, catalytic, inspirational mentality. I see these two things working together really nicely. I think of a boss or a theoretical politician or something. In order to be effective, you got to be able to run the show. Yeah, I got to be a ruler, know how the system works, take control, be responsible. But you also have to be a magician. You got to inspire people. You got to get people to rally behind you. You got people to believe in the goal that's taking place. So these two things, they pair really really well together, but they don't quite cancel each other out like the other ones do. Now the sage is all about wisdom, knowledge. This is the sort of typical intelligent person that you might meet, someone who knows a lot, loves sharing their information and their knowledge with people. There's a healthy skepticism that comes with the sage. They kind of have to see it to believe it. Um, but the sage can fall into this pattern of being dogmatic, that this is the way we've always done things, this is how we will continue to do things at all times. And there's an arrogance that comes with these people sometimes. They're very smart and they'll let you know it. They'll let you know just how smart they are. And they can also lack this empathy because, well, I don't see why it's so hard. We just do this, this, and this. And it's this sort of arrogance that comes with that lacking of empathy. Other times they might shut themselves off from new ideas because it's sort of a challenge to their own knowledge, and that can be humiliating or something they don't want to have to deal with. The jester is about living in the moment, having fun and living in the moment, finding joy in everything that they're taking part in, and the humor that comes with that. Um, the jesters living life in the moment can become irresponsible. They live life in the moment too much. They only want to have fun all the time, and that leads to debauchery and irresponsibility. Also, their humor begins to shift away from, hey, let's make everybody laugh, to, hey, I just want to make myself laugh. And that's when those jokes turn cruel and the pranks turn mean. These two can cancel each other out a little bit. The humor and the living life in the moment seems to counteract that stuffy, pompous, arrogant attitude of the sage. Kind of don't take yourself so seriously. And the sage's wisdom and knowledge sort of counteracts that irresponsibility and debauchery. Um, I actually think the jester pairs a little bit better with the ruler. I mean, think about like humor, living life in the moment, uh, versus someone who's rigid and controlling and like everything has to be in its neat place. Well, hey, just have fun, live life in the moment. In fact, that's more of the odd couple pair, isn't it? And then the sage and magician. I mean, the magician's sort of all about this realm of sort of feeling, like that's probably a good way to describe it. Like the magician is about like I feel this way. I have this urge or this feeling. I'll just feel better if I do these things. Whereas the sage is like, nope, I'm all cerebral. I process things like this. If I don't see it, I can't believe it. So you have these two things, and the sage is going to would prevent the magician from falling into a cult because the sage's skepticism would kind of pull back from that. And likewise, the transformative, healing, and inspired nature of the magician is going to pull away from that arrogant, like, I know everything. Like, the magician knows they don't know everything. Well, the imbalanced sage thinks they do. So these pairings, I don't know. I'm not so sure. I think the magician and the sage pair better, and the ruler and the jester pair better. That's just me. So look at your highest scores. To summarize this whole thing, it's going to look at your highest scores, and it's going to look at your lowest scores. It's going to give you a printout that identifies both your 3 highest and your 2 lowest. And what you want to look at with your high scores is, once again, do these make me feel empowered or limited in some way? That might clue you in. Are these strengths or weaknesses? Because you can have a high score, but you can fall into those imbalanced sides just as easily as you can fall into the strengths. So does it make me feel empowered, or does it make me feel limited or weak? Your low scores, think of, they represent a shadow. Is it a shadow? Is it something that you project onto others, or something you don't like in yourself that you're not even aware of? That's what you want to think of with that. And lastly, once again, how does your life influence the appearance of these archetypes? So that about does it. I do have this page once again, these objects that I gathered from the house, mostly kids' toys, but as I said, I look at each one kind of representing one of the PMAI archetypes. So we'll start with our innocent. Who's the innocent here? Well, I don't have anybody answering, so we're going to say the baby. The baby is quite innocent. How about our orphan? Who's our orphan? If you look around here, there might be a couple characters that are literal orphans. Not sure. At least I see 1 or 2, 3, kind of really. But Batman, his being an orphan really defines him. It's his death of his parents that drove him to become a crime fighter. Now, uh, our warrior is Perseus here from Greek mythology, and here he's holding the head of Medusa. This warrior Perseus was very, very balanced. He went out to help his mother. The evil king Polydectes sent him on this quest to get rid of him, and Perseus, through the help of Athena and some of the other gifts from other gods, managed to slay Medusa. Now, he does use the head to turn some people to stone a couple of times in the myth, but overall, he's a really balanced warrior, because in the end, he gives that head of Medusa to Athena, because no man should have that power. No man should be able to wield a power that could turn an entire army to stone. That just wouldn't be right. So here we have our caregiver, which is the Barbie with the baby. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. You got this mom character. Actually, I believe it's Princess Jasmine, but you have this mom character holding the baby, taking care of it. Our seeker is another Disney character. We got Flynn Rider from Tangled. I think he just looks like a seeker. He's got the big hiking boots on. I got him looking off into the distance, like, what's his next goal? What's his next dream? And in the movie Tangled that he's from, he has a bit of a seeker. He's kind of a rogue, kind of an adventurer, and he's got a goal in mind. He's going to get this money, and he's going to go off and buy a little island for himself and just hang out by himself all alone. So he's a bit of an imbalance seeker. He's got no ties to people. He's pushing people away. A little bit of an imbalance seeker there. So our lover, another one pretty easy to see, is our Ken doll here with a little bouquet of flowers. Maybe he's going to give Princess Jasmine these flowers or something like that. Straight up, he's about relationships. I mean, the whole toy is designed so Barbie has a relationship with somebody. That's kind of what he's all about. Okay, our destroyer is going to be the big bad dragon over here. For no other reason, just that dragons destroy stuff. I got no other reason for it other than that. It just seemed to fit nicely. Our creator is up on the top. It's William Shakespeare. He's a creative guy, wrote all those plays. At least we can assume he did. I guess there's talk that he probably didn't, or he ripped off a bunch of ideas from other playwrights. But hey, It's his name on the books, right? So we'll stick with William Shakespeare as our creator. Now our ruler is right next to him. This is Gorilla Grodd, but um, in a way, I just liked him for the ruler because he's a big gorilla. I think of a silverback gorilla leading the I don't know, what do you call a herd of gorillas, or a family? I guess a family of gorillas. Additionally, I put a little crown on him. Make sure he looked like he was in charge. A little princess crown. Uh, Also, it could be King Kong. The King Kong ruler being implied. If he's Gorilla Grodd, then that's fine too. He wants to rule. He's that would be a sage ruler combo, but um, ruler would still fit. Our magician is this pro wrestler toy, The Undertaker. I'm a big wrestling fan, so um, I couldn't really find anything else that really fit the magician amongst my kids' toys. And I thought, well, the Undertaker, he's kind of a magician. He's inspiring. He is awe-inspiring in his own way, or was. He had a cult at one point, a cult following him around called the Ministry of Darkness. So you got this guy. He kind of fits. I photoshopped some blue flames into his hands. Make him look a little more magical. He actually has magical powers in the show. Uh, so he's a fit as good as I can get. Our sage is the robot droid down here. If I had a C3PO, I would have used him, but I don't. So we just have a robotic sage guy. I think of, once again, maybe a slightly imbalanced sage, because robot robot sages are typically kind of imbalanced because they don't have those feelings to counteract the logic and the reasoning and all that sort of stuff. So it fits. And then last but not least, our jester is the little elf on the shelf, this little trickster guy that you hide him around the house, and the kids love finding him, and you put him in funny positions, and he's supposed to be really comical. All right, so there you have it. If you have any other questions or anything else that you want to discuss about the PMAI, be sure to contact your instructor. And other than that, I hope you enjoyed the little lecture, and uh, best of luck with interpreting your own PMAI scores.